In one of my previous videos, I went over game dev time wasters, ways that you waste your time as a game developer, and in the comments, somebody had a suggestion to look into feature creep as a way of wasting time. I thought that was a really good idea, so I wanted to make this video on it. My name's Kyle, I'm a full-time game dev. I make game development videos just like this one twice per week on my channel, so give me a subscribe if you want to get more of these. To start out our discussion on scope creep, or feature creep as it's sometimes called, first, let's just get a definition of that so that we all know what we're talking about. So this is really basic, but I think it's important to recognize up front, what do we mean when we say scope creep? So scope creep is anything in a project where the scope of that project as it was originally set when the project began expands. Now that can be good or bad, and it really depends on prioritization and a couple of things that we're going to get into later on. I've worked on all kinds of projects with all kinds of people at pretty much any size. So these are things that I think could work especially well with indie games. And so that's the angle I'm going to talk about it from. I mentioned earlier that some scope creep or some feature creep can be good. And so by good, I really mean that it's a way of adapting to change. And you really should adapt to change throughout the course of development on your game because it helps you see what you may have done wrong. It helps you see maybe you had an assumption about a game mechanic and it just doesn't work when you go play test it. So how do you know the difference? So the first thing that you start out with is just to track it. This assumes that you have some kind of project tracking. If you don't, I really suggest you do that. It doesn't have to be anything complex. You don't have to have a massive overblown process to do this. You can really, if you want to, keep track of it in a text file. When you recognize there's a new thing coming in, maybe it's a new idea, maybe it's a piece of feedback, is just to throw that in your backlog of work. So that just captures the idea in that moment and tosses it in there so you can review it later. One really valuable thing that you can do is to go back and compare that feature or that particular idea to what you had in your game design document. If you don't have a game design document, do yourself a favor, go write one. These things don't have to be massive tomes. They can be a single one-pager. But it really helps you to have all your ideas down, not only in the beginning to document those ideas, but so you can use that document later on to compare these things to, so that you can make decisions that help your game and don't waste your time. So when you're investigating those new things that come into your backlog, there's a couple questions you can ask yourself to determine, is this something I really need to include in my game, or is this just scope creep? First one of these questions is, does it actually make the game better? So if you look at this objectively and you look at that task and you've defined what better means, does that idea make the game better? Or does it just expand its scope? Because that can be a really key differentiation between something that is bad scope creep and something that might be an idea that you should incorporate in your game. So if the answer is no, after you've gone and thought about that, maybe you talk to your teammates about it if you have them, just don't do it. Get rid of it. It's not helping you on the project at that point in time. There's no reason for you to keep that around. If it's yes, keep that around in your backlog and think about when you might want to do it later on. Going on to another question that I like to ask is, does this feature fit in the core game loop? And if it doesn't, then don't do it. How do you know what that core game loop is? You've looked at your game design document. You've been able to compare to what your big concept of the game is so that you can make that decision to say, cool, I want to do this. This is going to help me maybe sell more copies. It's going to help players have a better time. It's going to get me more positive reviews, that kind of thing. Which brings us to this last question that is, take the other stance. Say, what happens if I don't do this? What happens if I don't put this in my game? If nothing happens, then don't do it. That probably meant it wasn't important enough for you to include in your game in the first place, so you can save time in development by not doing that thing. So let's say you've gone through this kind of combing through your backlog of ideas that you've had, you've decided some things might be worth investigating. How do you do that in a way that isn't going to totally derail your project? That's where time boxing comes in. What you can do is decide when is a good time for you to do this, number one, and number two, how long should you actually spend doing it? So how do you time box things? You set your time limit. You say, I'm just going to spend 3 days on this. Really important here is move that somewhere that's not part of your main project, because you might not do that work. And you really want to have this as like your prototyping space so that you can work on just that idea that you want to investigate and see if it's valuable. This is where things like version control really help you. So if you're not using a version control system, please consider using version control for your projects. Really bad things happen when you don't, and they really save your ass more than you might think. So let's say you've gone in and time boxed, you've done some prototyping, you see how this feature is going to go out. You can go back to those original questions that I posed about this again, So did it make the game better? Did it fit the core gameplay? If you have a close-knit group of users that you want to test with, you could try testing with them. If you don't, you'll have to make that decision on your own. Obviously, players are going to be the best way for you to determine if this is a great thing, but be very careful about that feedback because everyone will have a different idea about what is great in your game. So at the end of the day, it's your job to go in and take all that feedback and make a decision and say, yes, this is going in my game, and then you commit, decide to do it, and move on. I know this video has been a little bit different than my usual style, so hopefully you guys like this. I really wanted to go more in depth with this topic and talk about some more ideas that I've had around scope creep and how I've dealt with it in the past, both for my game as well as for a ton of other projects that I've worked on. So if this has been useful to you all, give me a like, give me a subscribe, let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and if you have any other ideas for how you deal with scope creep, be sure to let me know those too. I'll see you next time.